Well, Afghan President Hamid Karzai has called for an investigation into what is described as the biggest coordinated Taliban attacks this year. Karzai says intelligence failures on the part of the U.S.-led forces allowed the militants to sneak into the most secure neighborhoods. The weekend assault in the capital Kabul and elsewhere left over 50 people, including 4 civilians and 11 Afghan soldiers dead. Washington has dismissed Karzai's claim, saying the attacks were likely carried out by the Pakistan-based Haqqani network. This comes weeks ahead of the NATO summit in Chicago, where Karzai is expected to ink a strategic pact with the U.S. Meanwhile, the U.S. is reportedly gearing up for a major offensive in the war-torn nation. Reports say the U.S.-led spring offensive will be in the regions that control the main access routes into Kabul. Joining us now from studios in Washington is author and historian Dr. Webster Tarpley. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Dr. Tarpley. Now, how much of an impetus would Sunday's events provide for the U.S.-led forces, for their own spring offensive, which is being described as a major one in Afghanistan?
Well, this is a kind of a mini Tet, something like the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in the early months of 1968, but on a much smaller scale. And it shares with Tet the idea that the main results here are political rather than military. Militarily, these 7 attacks, 3 in the capital, Jalalabad, Gardez, a few other places, these have not been militarily very successful. Politically, they've been extremely successful. And it raises once again here in the war-weary American people, what is the point of all this? The standard answer is that it's to prevent Al-Qaeda from gaining a base. But of course, the U.S. and the British have been helping Al-Qaeda to take over large parts of Libya as a base, or Somalia if they want that. So this really doesn't amount to anything. I actually think Karzai may have a point on this. We've had a series of events. The attack on the U.S. Embassy last September. We had the insult to the dead bodies of the Afghan guerrillas in January, the Quran burning in February, and then the murder of almost 20 civilians by 1 or more, I think more, U.S. forces. All of these seem to be somehow too easy. What they seem to add up to is a desire to accelerate the departure. And I think also the following. What circulates here in Washington is called the Divine Plan. Divine was a CIA official. And the Divine Plan says, forget about counterinsurgency. Focus on counterterrorism only. That means drones, aircraft, and at most some special forces flying around in helicopters. And then leave the rest to the Afghan forces. And I think we can just take that one step further. If it's Karzai on the ground, that's fine. But maybe from the U.S. point of view, it's better if it's the Taliban, because Karzai, as soon as he's on his own, is going to bring in the Chinese, whereas the feature of the Taliban that the U.S. has always liked is that they keep everybody out. They can't get along with anybody, at least the old Taliban. If the current Taliban are anything like the ones in the 1990s, they can't get along with anybody. Not Russia, not China, not Iran, just nobody. So in many ways, that would be the goal for the U.S.
Right, but Dr. Tarpley, the events unfolding in the country at the moment are being used as a basis for pushing through the strategic security pact between the Afghans and Americans. The American ambassador to Afghanistan, Crocker, just recently said that the events of Sunday prove that the U.S. cannot leave the country, at least not as far as the deadline that has been set by Obama goes. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that's a losing or minority position. Again, what I outlined just a minute ago is a strategy for an open-ended, endless U.S. presence. It doesn't end in 2014. It just goes to a different mode. And it keeps Afghanistan in a perpetual state of low-intensity guerrilla conflict where no oil pipelines can be built, no natural gas pipelines can be built, no railroad from India to Europe can be built through the Khyber Pass. It remains a kind of a dead zone of economic development. And if you can keep the Chinese out of the mineral deposits that have been found in the last couple of years, so much the better. The sad thing is that we have no peace movement left here in the United States. Under normal circumstances, a peace movement would be able to say, all right, this is enough now, get out, get out. Since the foundations here control the peace movement and the foundations are supporting Obama's timetable and his benchmarks, so to speak, there's very little popular resistance. It may well be that in NATO countries that are participating in this adventure, that there'll be a backlash. Maybe France might be one. Who knows what could happen there? Or some other NATO countries. And if they begin to leave, that could also accelerate the departure. Anything that's signed by Obama and Biden, I think, is not worth the paper that it's written on, especially if it's a pledge to Karzai, whom the U.S. has barely tolerated all these years.
Well, the Afghan president wants to launch an investigation into Sunday's attacks. What would you say has prompted this, considering serious intelligence failures have taken place before in the course of the U.S. occupation?
I think he may be onto something. I think he is probably right that there are intelligence factions on the U.S. side that wanted one or more of these things to happen for reasons that are maybe hard to reconstruct from afar or from the outside. But I think there's every reason to investigate this. And the statements, of course, from the State Department go right into the circular file. This is simply the big lie as practiced at Foggy Bottom.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. That was author and historian Dr. Webster Tarpley there, joining us from studios in Washington. Dr. Tarpley, as always, it was a pleasure having you here on Press TV.